Today on Steve's Garage, I'll be showing you how to replace your inner and outer tie rods. These components are vital to your steering, so it's not something you should put off changing if there's signs of them being worn out. Additionally, you should change both sides if you can. They're like shoes. If one is worn out, the other isn't far behind. If you drive a P80 Volvo or 2nd Gen Ford Escape, I actually have specific videos for those cars. You can check out links in the description or just search my channel. This video will be more of a general guide on how to replace tie rods if you don't drive one of those vehicles. You may have seen my video about diagnosing a bad tie rod while it's on the car, but I want to take a second and show you what a bad tie rod looks like once it's removed. As you can see, there is a ton of play and the joint is easily moved by hand. A new tie rod should be really stiff and tough to move by hand. Keep in mind that these are steering components, so if you can easily move it with your own hand, imagine what it's doing on the car. Let's talk about the tools you'll need. Keep in mind that sizes differ per car, and in my case, differ between the old and new parts. So be sure to double check your car and parts before going out and buying any specific tools you may not own. For the most part, they're pretty general tools. Screwdrivers, pliers, some blue Loctite, side cutters, vice grips, Edgar-style hose clamp pliers. You may not need those depending on how your boots are held on. Sockets for the outer tie rod nut, wrenches for the jam nut, a hammer, breaker bar. A torque wrench isn't a bad idea, but I wouldn't run out and buy one if you don't already own one. Just make sure you have something long enough to really tighten everything down. Most importantly, an inner tie rod tool. You can rent these for free from your local parts store, and it will make your life much easier than trying to use a wrench. The jam nut that's up against the outer tie rod should be loosened first. It's a lot easier to do and everything is still connected. Next, move to the nut on the underside of the spindle. Sometimes this can be a castle nut with a cotter pin through it. If it is, break the cotter pin first and then remove the nut. If you want, you can use a pickle fork to remove the outer tie rod from the spindle, but I've rarely needed one. You can see I did use one here, but typically a few hits on the spindle or the bottom of the tie rod itself and it'll pop right out. Now you can remove the outer tie rod. When you do this, you want to count how many turns it takes to come off. This is so when you put the new one back on, you can get it close to where it was, but it'll never be perfect and you will need to get a front end alignment when you complete this job. Unfortunately, my jam nut was actually seized, so I had to cut the boot to get it off the inner tie rod. Hopefully this isn't the case for you. You can just cut the clamps or zip ties holding the boot on, slide it off, and it's all good. In my opinion, don't plan on reusing the old boots. They are the same age as the tie rods that just failed, and if you reuse them and then they end up failing, now you're back here doing pretty much the same job you already did. Before removing the inner tie rod, it's not a bad idea to brace the steering rack. This will keep it from rotating and possibly damaging anything internally. In my case, a vice grip braced against the subframe worked great, so just figure out whatever works best for your car. The last thing you want to check is if there's a set pin on the inner tie rod. Some have it, some don't. If you do see it there, just pop it out with a screwdriver, and then we can get to work. Your tool may look different than mine, but it's the same basic idea. Find that open end wrench that fits over the end of the tie rod, slip that on, slip whatever tool or tube you have onto it, and it should break loose pretty easily. In my case, it was still a little too tight to come off by hand, so I switched to vice grips. That was easier than wielding that giant tube and breaker bar, but just keep at it and it'll come off eventually. Before installing anything, it's not a bad idea to check your old parts versus your new parts. Like I said, hardware sizes may differ, but the general size and shape of everything should be pretty consistent. Before installing that new inner tie rod, you want to put some blue Loctite on those threads. Start by threading it in by hand, then you can finish it off with that giant tool. There is typically a torque spec for this, but it's usually low enough that if you're tightening it with a breaker bar, you'll be more than fine. Like I mentioned earlier, I wouldn't go out and buy a torque wrench just for this job, but if you've got one, definitely look up the spec for your car and tighten it accordingly. Now it's time for the boots. Mine came with an Edgar-style clamp for the inner side. That's the type of clamp that you typically see on a CV axle, and if yours came with that, you'll need that specific set of pliers like I mentioned earlier. My outer was just a zip tie, which is pretty common for tie rods. If that's how yours came, I wouldn't worry about it. You want to make sure the boot is properly seated on both the inner and outer edges. Especially the outer edge, you want to make sure that it's pushed up far enough that you have the flat spots for the wrench to adjust your tie rods. Some boots will come with a little vent on them. If yours does, make sure that it's lined up properly to function. Otherwise, tighten everything down and then we can get on to installing the outer tie rod. Start by threading the jam nut up pretty far under the tie rod. If you live in the snow, it's not a bad idea to apply some Never Sees. Your alignment tech will thank you. Now you can thread on the outer tie rod, keeping in mind how many turns it took to come off. Once it's in place, you can snug the jam nut against it to keep it from moving, but there's no need to tighten it down right now because that'll be easier once it's connected to the spindle. Some tie rods will have a counter hold, some won't. Mine had a small flat spot that nothing really fit, so I just used a pair of vice grips again. Like the inner tie rod, this will have a torque spec, but a breaker bar will give you more than enough leverage to make sure it's tight. If yours came with a castle nut and a cotter pin, now's the time to install it. Tighten it properly. If the holes don't line up, tighten it a little more, and then throw that cotter pin in, bend it around the tie rod stud, and you're good to go. I've installed both greasable and non-greasable outer tie rods, and I honestly don't think it makes a difference. Install whichever you'd like, but know that if you're going to go with greasable units, you need to have a grease gun, grease, and they become an additional maintenance item. Once you've tightened that jam nut down, you have successfully changed the tie rods on your car. Congratulations. Take the car for a drive and confirm everything is good, and remember that there are a lot of parts in your front end that can exhibit similar symptoms when they're worn. So if you're still having problems after replacing your tie rods, check your control arms, end links, or ball joints. Also, don't forget to schedule an alignment because that's just as important for steering and tire wear as the tie rods themselves. If you found this video helpful, please think about subscribing to the channel and go check out some of my other tutorial videos. Feel free to leave any questions or comments below. I do my very best to answer everybody. Thank you so much for watching.